All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Empire. I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Santiago Santos, and Mr. Jake Brukhman, OG in crypto, NFT pioneer, founder and CEO of CoinFund, launched in 2015, one of the best funds in the entire industry. Jake has been, I think I've known you, Jake, maybe since 2017 or 2018. And the thing about knowing Jake is it's really frustrating because you're consistently like a solid 18 to 24 months ahead of everybody else. And every time I see you put something out, whether it's like 2018 investing in NFTs or like 2019 starting to go kind of all in on things like DeFi, it's like you are consistently what feels like so early to different trends and just like so spot on with different things. The multi-chain future, I think I remember you guys investing in I forget what it was, maybe Polkadot back in the day, just very early to the multi-chain thesis. So anyways, Jake, welcome to Empire, my friend.
Well, that's an amazing introduction. Thank you so much for having me, Jason and Santiago.
Yeah, of course. There are so many things we could talk about here, but we are going to spend this episode focusing on is crypto a public good? Are crypto networks public goods? And here's kind of the outline of what I want to do. One is just like first introduce public goods, private goods, common goods, why it's important to talk about this topic, define these topics. The second is really how do like public goods and private goods and common goods apply to technology today, talk about open source code, and then figure out how this applies to crypto today. And the reason, out of all the topics that we could talk about, the reason I think this is so important is at a time when kind of these like these ideals that govern America are kind of, it feels like they're almost like stalling out. We have this tool that opens a new door for different kinds of participation, different kinds of accountability, this like a democracy native to the internet. And if you know where to look within crypto right now, there's all this creativity and experimentation and governance happening from like these small groups like Constitution DAO to these massive protocols. And I think what we will discover is that crypto enables coordination towards what labor and cooperative movements have struggled to achieve, like putting ownership of value into the hands of those who created it. So Jake, I want to start very broad here before we go deeper, which is like, why is this an important topic to discuss? Why is public goods and private goods and common goods, why is it important to think about that in the lens of crypto?
Because we as investors and researchers in the blockchain technology space, we're constantly trying to understand what is this technology that we're dealing with. And it's like that famous cartoon where, you know, people are in a room and they're touching different parts of the elephant and they're blind and everyone thinks the elephant is like something different, right? And, you know, there are people who have looked at blockchain and they said, oh, blockchain, it's a, you know, efficiency technology for banks. Like the most likely use case of blockchain is to facilitate settlement in banking, right? And then there's like other people who've looked at it and said, no, it's actually like a lot more disruptive than that. You can build or you can rebuild the entirety of like all financial services, you know, as smart contracts, remove a lot of intermediaries and actually serve all of finance. And then some other people said, no, you guys are crazy. Blockchain is all about taking pictures of cats and making them scarce and then like trading them as collectibles, right? And so like as a researcher, one of my goals is to just understand like what in general is this technology doing? What is it like poised to do? And what are going to be some of the biggest use cases of it? And one theme that keeps reemerging as we actually build protocols, as we get DeFi out there, as we get, you know, NFT exchanges out there, as we get AMMs, as we get other crypto networks, is that like what is embodied in a crypto network is a fundamentally different way of organizing humans. And so the question is, why? Like, what are the differences? Like, how is it good? How is it bad? How is it different? And the next question is like, what does that mean for the future? Like if this is a new way of organization, like how are people likely to use this at scale, or will it ever get to scale? And one of the things that if you ask me, right, like one of the clearly quote unquote like disruptive things about how crypto networks organize is that they present a way that goods and services can, first of all, be owned, and second of all, be governed by the users of those things. In other words, it starts to look a little bit like public goods. Maybe like you can think of that maybe as like nonprofits in the traditional world would be the analog. Or you can look at it as just, products and services that should be available to all humans on Earth. And the way that like we understand today in the traditional world how those goods are implemented, how they're brought to market, is essentially through like government, right? Like, government is the thing that can facilitate things that are meant for the public good. But what blockchain technology is showing us, as is the case in like, if we study the governance of like the Bitcoin network, the Ethereum network, various DeFi protocols, DAOs, and so forth, is that you now have enough digital technology that implementation through government isn't the only possible implementation anymore, right? And this has like an analog in kind of like the cryptocurrency view of blockchain as well. Like what Bitcoin people have said for years is, hey, nation states had a monopoly on money, but in going to Bitcoin, that monopoly is dissipated. Like anyone can, now put in 8 lines of code as a Solidity smart contract or use Bitcoin or whatever it is, and they can use a currency that is public, open, borderless, permissionless, forkable, and to some extent governable, depending on which one you're talking about. And now this is a new way of implementing a public good, if that makes sense.
Great, man. So that's a really interesting place to start. I think to set up the conversation here as we dig into it, can you define public goods versus private goods versus common goods?
Yes. Well, there's a very like technical definition from economics. So let me start there, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about like the just the more practical definition. So there's these two properties of goods that economists define in search of the answer there, which is excludability and rivalry. So we say that a public good is one that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Excludability means that like you can sort of prevent certain people from using the service, but you can't, but you only provide the service to a certain subgroup of people, right? So, for example, enjoying the sun would be non-excludable. I can't really charge you for enjoying the sun and then prevent you from enjoying the sun if you don't pay me. But I can do that if I'm a publisher of a magazine and you're a customer who's seeking a subscription, right? So that's excludability. And rivalry refers sort of to like the abundance of that thing. Again, the sun, while it doesn't have infinite energy, it still has so much energy that it will probably be more energy than everyone on Earth will ever need, like forever, right? Forever that matters. Whereas internet bandwidth has the property that if like a lot of people are using the thing, there might not be enough bandwidth for you, right? And so they're in this like rivalrous relationship. So a public good is one that is non-excludable, everyone can use it, and non-rivalrous. It is basically like really abundant. A common good is one that is, I believe, non-excludable, but potentially rivalrous. And so one interesting question to address here, like in our context, is like, for example, is a blockchain, by those types of definitions, is it a common good or a public good? And the answer seems to be that it's actually, well, it kind of depends which aspect of the blockchain you're talking about. But I want to take a very like general view and say, participating in a blockchain just means like, can I connect to that network? Can I interact with that network? Can I send transactions in that network? Can I run a node in that network? And in that sense, blockchains seem to be non-excludable. Like we don't charge people for belonging to a blockchain network and then exclude people, that don't pay or something like that. Anyone can, by the definition of this network being open, anyone can run a node. Anyone can put in a transaction, whether it's valid or invalid. Now, it is true that you have to pay, though, for that transaction to be processed, in the sense of if I want to send you some Bitcoin, I got to pay a transaction fee. If I want to execute an Ethereum smart contract, I got to pay you a transaction fee. But that's what makes blockchain networks actually kind of rivalrous, right? Like we've seen this before. If there's a lot of transactions going into Ethereum and we sort of reach, kind of carrying capacity of whatever Ethereum is capable of today in terms of throughput, then the next person who puts in a transaction, it might just take a long time for it to get through, or he might have to or she pay a higher fee. And that's, I think, what makes blockchains rivalrous in that sense. And so I think that makes blockchain a common good. And I think a private good would then be, I believe by implication, something that is both excludable and rivalrous. And maybe that's something like a good in an Amazon warehouse. I'm ordering pots for plants on Amazon these days. And, if I don't pay for one, I'm not going to receive it. And also, if I buy all of them, the next customer is not going to get the next one. Okay. So those are the very technical definitions of public, common, private good. And then in a practical sense, or maybe even just a colloquial sense, what does it mean to have a public good? Well, it means it's a different way of delivering a product or service. It's a way of delivering this product or service that doesn't require a profit margin. I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily, it can't be profitable. This is a key sort of distinction in the blockchain space here, which we can get into. But it doesn't have a profit margin. When we think of traditional capitalist goods being delivered to the market, we think of a company building that product or service, right, distributing it, charging for it, and their goal is to create a profit margin, to make a return for their investors, for their shareholders, and so forth. But in a public or common good, we don't require that margin. This is for the good of the people. And the other practical sense that we think about public goods as what regime public goods and operate in is governance, right? So in corporations, we have generally a CEO, managing partners, a board, even a public board in a public corporation. And those are the people who make sure that the shareholders are getting a return. But in a public or common good, we're just trying to have a measure of governance that assures that the distribution of this good is fair, right? And that's usually presumably done by the government, or it's done by people who have volunteered, to have that capacity. So those are the two practical ways in which we understand these goods.
A lot of no, Jake, I think that's a very good overview. I guess turning it more specifically to crypto, I think a lot of the discussion that you've seen over time is everything that is being created in what you could think of as infrastructure, is that going to be a common good? Is value actually going to accrue to some of these protocols or not? I'm curious to get your take on how you think of the different pieces of the stack that are being built in Web3, and where do you see value accruing, and where do you see value perhaps not accruing, what other people might think it will?
Yeah, great question. Well, so I think that the ability to create, let's say, common goods in crypto, does not, not every technological innovation needs to replace all the previous technological innovations. Sometimes a technological innovation becomes a tool in your toolkit. And we see this like in crypto broadly in the following sense. We have certain projects that are extremely decentralized networks, and we have other projects that are very much private, centralized companies that use the value propositions of blockchains or cryptocurrency in some way, right? And it's not that like, oh, we discovered decentralization and then everything turned decentralized. That experiment was run in 2017, the year when Jason and I met during the ICO boom, right? And the trend was like everything has to be decentralized. So the ability to create a common good doesn't have to supersede like every other model that we have. We can create private goods, we can create public goods, we can create common goods. It is a tool. What's really interesting to me, and I want to be clear that this is philosophy. I think we still are yet to see, we need to see more evidence in the market of this. But what's really cool is that traditionally implemented public goods very much don't create a return. This is because they have this like zero margin thing. But public goods created using crypto networks have an opportunity to create a return, even though they are a zero margin. And the way that that might look is, for example, let's take a concrete example, maybe like ENS, right? So ENS is it's a network that manages Ethereum domains, and it's a set of smart contracts. And there is a governance system in ENS. Like if you are an ENS token holder, you can vote on proposals about the network, and you can also delegate your tokens to someone who will vote on your behalf. And as a matter of fact, I personally am a delegate on ENS. ENS as a network is not really a for-profit network. Like it does charge you money for, let's say, registering a domain. But I would argue that the network operates at cost. So if it's operating at cost, how can this network create a return? Well, and the answer is that because this network is a public good, or let's say common good, and because it is governable by the people who are in that network, who use that network, that governance value might be reflected in the token asset. And so if you're just a user of the network, you have this great value proposition of being able to use this service at cost, which is going to be the lowest price that you can possibly get for this service in the market. It'll certainly be lower than centralized providers who have this higher profit margin. And yet, you might be, as a governor of this protocol, you might get a return if you govern it correctly. And so that's like in my opinion, that's highly disruptive to how products and services have been implemented in the past. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think generally, if you look at Web 2, a lot of value has been accruing at the very top. And there's a whole stack that it provides a ton of value, but there hasn't really been a way to monetize that. Just writ large, there hasn't been a way to monetize open source effectively and compensate contributors. And I think when I try to explain crypto to people that perhaps are caught up in this Bitcoin, blockchain, not crypto, I say, wait a minute, but like open source is really powerful, and you have a way now to more equitably and efficiently, programmatically reward contributors in any open source system. And I think a lot of public good infrastructure has come out of open source development. And now the novelty here is that you can perhaps embed a more precise mechanism, a new way to monetize these contributions of these open source networks. And then I think the state in which we're in right now in crypto is like our governance tokens going to accrue value. Is all the value going to accrue at the bottom kind of L1 layer kind of fat protocol thesis that placeholder guys initially kind of coined? Or are we going to see perhaps value be distributed in a different way? I think a lot of people are caught up in analogies which make it easier for the brain to understand certain things, but always inherently miss a lot of the novelties of new pieces of technology. And I think it's just it's important to be open-minded. And candidly, I think no one really kind of knows I think it's more of a relative question of where will value, as an investor, which you're constantly thinking, where's my dollar better served investing in an L1 that captures MEV, in a DeFi protocol that provides core pieces of financial infrastructure, or in a aggregator, whether it be an exchange or a wallet or something else. And I think that's the more difficult question, because also it's quite early, and so we don't really know. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is an attention game. And so, yeah, open questions. I don't think there's a perfect answer. I'm curious if you have a different view.
No. So I think you talked about a few things there. So one thing you talked about was open source. So I totally agree. Open source is a great example of this. Repositories and like the groups of people around repositories who build up the software are a special case of a public good. It's like they're creating the software, they're putting in a lot of their time, effort, coding ability, talent, etc., to create this code base. And people have different motivations for doing that. But the point is that the result is it often has a non-proprietary license. It's open to forking, to modification. It's certainly open to like use, perhaps even commercial use. But there's no clear business model on open source. And this has been a problem, right? Because there's been some very important pieces of software that maintain, just huge amounts of our technology stack, like in the world, right? That have been open source. I mean, think about like, I don't know, SSL or something like that, right? Or just different frameworks for building websites. And many other things, right, that large corporations and big tech companies use that are critical to their operations, but they never pay for the software. The software is like never licensed in this for-profit way. So how does that work? I mean, it seems to be completely contrary to capitalism. And the answer seems to be that, well, first of all, in many of these cases, you have kind of private sponsors that donate money to these projects. So you've seen things like Sun buying the Java programming language, right? And you have maybe other like non-monetary compensation that contributors might accept. So they might accept for the fact, the fact that they worked on a very famous repo might actually help them get a job, in another context. So there's a sort of indirect reputational value to doing that. But when you go over to the sort of crypto model, or the model that we have seen in crypto, then you turn that architecture, or I like to call it the operating system of how you produce these goods, you turn that completely on its head, because now you can do things like say, you know what, if you're a contributor to this repository and your pull request is accepted, then you can get some tokens. And when you get some tokens, you're allowed to vote on which pull request is accepted next. And if you've worked on this for a long time and you've made many pull requests, you're going to have more voting power because you're going to have more tokens. And as well you should, right? Because if you look at like Linux, there's very clearly a small number of people who are extremely knowledgeable about how Linux is implemented, Linus Torvalds. And arguably, Linus Torvalds should have more, commit power than other people who are just joining the project because he's been working on it for 30 years or whatever, right? And so this is almost a hand in glove, sort of fit for can we make open source sustainable? And there's, of course, as you guys know, there's many projects in the space including Radical and Gitcoin and others, right, who are working on that problem.
Mm-hmm.
Santiago,
I think for the
oh yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to address the second thing that you mentioned, which was like value capture, which is also like an incredibly interesting topic. And yeah, I actually I met Joel Monegro back in the summer of 2016, a couple of weeks before he published Fat Protocols, and really appreciate sort of like his work there. But I also later published a post called "Fat Protocols Are Not an Investment Thesis," which was sort of a bunch of counterpoints to why value that we will see does not necessarily always have to migrate to the bottom of the stack. So there's a very there's a general sense in which Joel is very right about fat protocols, and there are a lot of like very specific senses in which we've seen monetization happen in crypto, not at the the base layer, and we see a lot of SaaS these days in crypto, for example, and those things do not. They're generally like their value isn't captured at the Ethereum base layer. It's captured higher in the stack.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of dispel some things. Like it's open source, but it does carry a cost, similar to perhaps maintaining a common good. Historically, it's been governments that, through taxation, enforce this idea of policing, patrolling, and providing a good that otherwise be kind of depleted because, like the ocean or parks, and therefore you tax individuals. And then the government is that central authority that takes on that responsibility, and people recognize that, and then they maintain these public goods, if you will. But they do carry a cost, and sometimes that's where people don't see, providing, I guess, like when you think about and extend that to crypto networks, which are economic and political in some sense. Even the Bitcoin network, the Ethereum network, miners are expending these resources, and it does carry a cost, and in return they get a reward. That I think the key novelty here is that it is a non-political system in the traditional sense, that it instead relies on programmatic, very predictable piece of code that is a block emission. And that is why people decide to coordinate, as you said earlier, and decide to expend a resource that has a cost in return for capturing some value. Now, a lot of that is a social construct, and we don't necessarily need to argue about that. But I think that's the key kind of piece of novelty, which is you're ultimately coordinating a certain level of resources, attention, energy, whatever that is, in exchange for maintaining a network which could be the same as, the analogy could be the same as a park or an ocean. Now, of course, these networks exist outside the traditional systems that we've historically used, instead rely on taxing people and the perceived level of violence if you don't do that. And that, I think, is something that is super powerful when we combine that in a digital age and context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jake, can I ask a question about this? Okay, so you're arguing that these crypto networks are common goods, and when I think about other common goods, it's like mines and fisheries and like forests are the common examples. But what then maybe the pushback that a lot of people would have is like, okay, well, you have tragedy of the commons, right? Where like short-term self-interest of one person might, or like of a small group of people, leads to like this tragedy for all. And so the common example is like like grazing land or something like that, or like forests. Well, it's a common good, but then if like one person like over forests, it leads to like deforestation for all, right? And so like, what is the example here or the analogy to draw with like common goods, these like public resources, which ultimately potentially lead to like tragedy of the commons? Where do you see that existing in crypto today? And how does that make you think about how things like these crypto networks should actually, how they should play out?
Well, it's sort of like, maybe the analogy would be like, if you just had a very naive like ENS, where anyone can at any time register a domain and then keep it for as long as they wanted, then we would like very rapidly run it, like send the value of this network to zero, right? Why? Because you would like launch the network, someone would come in, they would register like all the domains, or maybe like a small number of people would register all the domains, hoping to get rich. And then the result would be like no one would get rich because the network wouldn't grow because no one could register a domain. And so it's like, I guess that would be like kind of a freeloader problem analogy there. But that's not how actually ENS works, right? ENS creates a bunch of economic incentives and disincentives and frictions to make sure that people don't do that. Like, for example, if you wanted to try to register everything at ENS, it would cost you a pretty penny. It would probably cost you more ether than you'd be able to get your hands on. And so what you're seeing there is that the smart contract system, I guess, that underpins ENS is creating solutions to that problem, right? And the analogy in the traditional world might be that, like, okay, you have this like nice park, right? The classical analogy where everyone brings their animal or their cow or whatever to graze on the grass. But in the traditional context, the solution to that problem is the government coming in and saying, guys, this is a public park, but you know what? You're only allowed to bring your cow here for an hour every day or something like that, creating these limitations. And so in both of these cases, we're looking at sort of the same problem, but what we're changing is the implementation of the solution. And that's what I think is so interesting, because there's a lot of advantages to having a smart contract-based or digital solution, or the ability to create many solutions that are digital. What are the advantages? Well, if solutions are software, then you can do everything with them that you can do with software. You can iterate them quickly. You can have a team working on them. You can have multiple versions of solutions compete for whoever, solves the problem the best. You can potentially roll out solutions more quickly, right? Like there's efficiencies to going this digital route that we didn't have before. But the setup is the same. Like I also spent a lot of time, reading up on kind of antitheses for crypto. There's a lot of people these days that identify, as like quote unquote crypto skeptics, or people just publishing articles like, fairly and rightly questioning whether, these constructs like smart contracts and cryptocurrencies, are actually useful constructs, whether they're valuable, whether they actually solve the problems that they claim to solve, or whether they're just sort of a money-making scheme, materials for money launderers and so forth. Let me give you sort of an example. In a lot of these critiques, people say like, if we go full crypto, we're going to create neoliberalism, and neoliberalism, doesn't work, and blah, blah, blah. And here's all this research why. And like, when they do that, they sort of base their understanding of the world on the following. There are private corporations, and those private corporations, or maybe even like public corporations, whether they're private or public doesn't matter, because what is salient is that they're all generally run by small numbers of people at the top, whether it be the public board or the private owner. And these corporations act in a way that they, first of all, want to maximize shareholder profit at the cost of absolutely everything else. And they also grow without bound and try to become monopolies. And then on the other side of this equation is the government, which is sort of the only technology that is available to keep those corporations in check and to prevent them from getting out of hand, and to make sure that the public good is preserved, and so on and so forth. And if you have that model of the world, then when some crypto person comes to you and says, hey, everything should be neoliberal, markets should be free, corporations and crypto projects should not be fettered by regulation, and everything should be financialized, right? We should tokenize everything, and those tokens should trade on secondary markets. To a person with that operating system, that sounds like a terrible, terrible idea. Because what that sounds like is, we want to give the evil corporations like all the power, and then by doing that, the corporations will abuse like the public good. But what our discussion about like blockchain-based common goods or public goods is about is not that like we want to create neoliberalism like per se, but that we're actually changing that operating system, right? Like what we're doing is we're saying there's actually an exit to this dichotomy between the evil corporation and the government intermediator. And what happens is that we change that operating system by realigning incentives, right? So like in the original model, it's like the corporation has incentive around itself and its shareholders, and then the government has incentive around the public good. But in our model, products and services can be owned by the public. And so the provision of public goods is facilitated in the public interest, right? And maybe okay, let's make that a little bit more concrete. So what is a digital public good that we think about these days? Okay, what about chat, right? Like you guys and I, we live in a world where, basic digital communication is sort of a fact of life. When I was growing up, I didn't have a computer. I just like talked to my teacher at school and my friends on the bus and whatever. But these days, I talk to, 17 countries in the course of a few hours during the day. This is all facilitated by the internet. It's facilitated by chat, by video, communication protocols, right? And yet when we think about like messaging or chat, in our current operating system, this is provided by Facebook. This is provided by Telegram. This is provided by a centralized corporate intermediary who, at the end of the day, like doesn't have a zero profit margin, doesn't want a zero profit margin. It wants a non-zero profit margin. And intermediaries like Facebook, they're perfectly happy to like read all of our messages. They're perfectly happy to monetize those things. We're perfectly happy to hand them over to government agencies. But if the good of chat or messaging was provided by a decentralized network, then you go to a new model where there isn't an intermediary that is seeking a margin or a profit, right? And therefore the problems of like, privacy that you have with Facebook, the problem of monetization, in some sense goes away. But then like, why is this, how can this thing be sustainable? Well, again, maybe it's the case that the people who use this chat are also giving it governance value, which is reflected in some kind of governance token of this network.
Do you ever think we'll reach that inflection? Because you ask most people today would probably say, look, yeah, privacy is important in the same way that like flood insurance is. Most people would agree with it, but then don't really take action and would much rather not pay for it, meaning they would much rather use a free application like Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp in exchange for giving up some sort of trade-off, whether it be either privacy or whatnot. And I do wonder, and maybe this was like, maybe a good case study of this was Binance Smart Chain, where a lot of users migrated and very quickly PancakeSwap, which was an AMM, similar to Uniswap, became more popular, more widely used by number of users than Uniswap, like overnight. And you're left wondering, if a very small subset of crypto users are willing to trade security in exchange for interacting with a less secure protocol because it's cheaper to interact with this, then I don't think it's a binary question of, I think it's more of, is this going to matter for sufficiently large population that it makes these networks sustainable. It's
So
sort of what I'm curious to get your perspective.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Today, it's much easier to go to Facebook, to go to a centralized provider, etc. And it's actually very hard to go into a decentralized network. It requires getting a wallet, getting Ether, all of the frictions that we in crypto are so familiar with and are working through. But the real question you're asking, Santiago, is like, is there a forcing function that slowly over time is raising the cost of the traditional thing and like lowering the cost of the crypto thing? And like, I think the answer is yes. And I think what that forcing function is, well, there's probably a bunch of them, but like a few that we could talk about are, well, some obvious ones would just be that like peer-to-peer technology is getting easier to use over time. It's getting cheaper. It's reaching like feature parity. It's reaching like UX parity. But that's not as interesting of an argument. The much more interesting argument is that, let's say, governments are becoming like more and more technologically advanced, right? Take a look at China. And as they become more technologically advanced, they become more invasive and they become more like authoritarian. And as that process continues, then the cost of using a centralized thing becomes higher and higher and higher, because those centralized things are usually like the way that governments like surveil people, right? So the answer to your question is like, if that forcing function gets to a point where governments become so invasive, that they just make the cost of using these technologies so high for users, then users will switch to alternatives.
Jake, I want to pivot from talking about crypto as a public good to crypto funding public goods. I'm not sure if you've thought too much about that, but it does feel like maybe one of the perfect end states of this is enabling some sort of coordination of these labor movements and cooperative movements, and to be able to really like fund these big public goods projects that I feel like the government hasn't been able to fund for maybe since like the mid 1900s, the big projects of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and maybe this is just lack of conviction in the government these days, but it does feel like something like solving climate change and these kind of things. Like it does feel like or implementing nuclear energy. It does feel like crypto public goods funding will create these, will solve these big issues, and that it won't come from a government solution, but that could just also be the me living my small crypto bubble. So I'm curious to get your take on that.
Well, so yeah, let's talk about like government funding for science, maybe, or something like that. But before we get there, here's like a non-government example of public goods funding, right? So for example, you might be aware that recently we've been making great advancements in the world of neural networks. We've been creating these large neural networks that are now doing, like, they rival what humans can do. We now have DALL-E 2. You give it some text, it magically materializes a picture of whatever you're talking about. We have GPT-3. You can now implement a customer service bot, and it's almost like people won't even know the difference between a human. It's almost like passing the Turing test right now. But all of these neural network models, which are they're called foundation models, they're all very, very big. I believe GPT-3 cost something like $15 million to train that model. I believe DALL-E was something like hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars to train that model. But all these models are controlled by private corporations, right? Like OpenAI, Google, Facebook, Amazon, so forth. There's a movement of founders right now who are saying, wait a minute, like, why should OpenAI determine like what text prompts I can put into their thing? Why is it only big companies that have access to the data sets that create these models? And by the way, the data set is like a huge component in how good the model will perform, right? So if you have great data sets, you're going to have great models. And in this context, like we could take some of this crypto technology we've been talking about and imagine a world where you don't need the sponsorship of a giant corporation who has all these like liabilities and interests, and also tends to behave, in these like proprietary closed source kind of ways. We no longer need those kinds of entities in order to create these models. We can now do it through crowdfunding. And there are groups in the market right now that are doing exactly that. Like they've put together teams of scientists who are creating analogs of DALL-E, GPT-3, and things like that, extending those models to different mediums. But using crypto, they could be like funded in a totally crowdsourced manner. So you imagine like a Kickstarter where different groups of scientists sort of pitch you like, hey, we're going to create like DALL-E, but instead of just pictures, it's going to be able to produce videos like based on your text description. Isn't that cool? And there's many different kinds of applications for that. Like, for example, you might want to be storyboarding a TV commercial, and that kind of tool might really help you in doing that, or probably many other use cases we can think about. And so a group of crowdfunders would like fund this model. They would get tokens. The proceeds from the token sale would be used essentially for the data set, for the compute. And then once the model is trained, it could be launched possibly on a decentralized network as well. And then the token holders would like get first dibs, or the tokens can be used to redeem computation in that model to get the outputs and so on, right? So that creates like a fundamentally different world where the openness of these models will really accelerate like all the technological progress around these models. And I think that's like really, really interesting. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. So I get how Ethereum and crypto creates more efficient donations and things like that. But do you think that we move from a system from individual and like one-time donations that are primarily funded by wealthy folks to like these new mechanisms where we make long-term commitments to fund public goods that happen from folks who aren't just like the mega wealthy, and it's more of on like a recurring basis instead of these big one-time donations? Is that the new system that gets set up, or?
Absolutely. I think, well, again, because of efficiency, right? Like it's now okay to donate 25 cents, to a cause, right? So the barrier to entry for things like donating, for things like governing the outputs of these processes, like it really goes down. Like listen, when you talk about like efficiency, it sounds really boring, but let me give you kind of an example of why actually these types of efficiencies are so impactful. When I was graduating high school back in the early 2000s, it probably cost about $1 million to start a tech startup. It's like, you needed a physical office, you needed computers, you needed recruiters, you needed to hire, people to do your HR, you needed to hire people to do benefits, you needed a lawyer. Like that process 20 or so years ago was like way more expensive than it is today, because in like 1999, 2000, 2001, there weren't that many tech startups. The cost of those processes over 20 years have gone down to like literally like nothing, right? Like you can register your company on LegalZoom. You could get Gusto for benefits. You have all kinds of SaaS software that, does peer review on your team and facilitates like all the processes that a tech startup needs to go through. And the result of the price of starting a startup going down so dramatically, what has been the result of that process? Well, the result is that there is now thousands of startups that come onto the market every month in the United States. And there's, I don't know the exact numbers off the top, there's, tens of thousands every year. And the fact that we can create startups at this rate means that we like find an Uber or a Facebook or an Airbnb, or the next big successful company much faster than when those startups could, needed $1 million to get started.
Doesn't that mean they'll necessarily be profitable? But yeah. Well, Jake, this has been a fascinating discussion. I do want to end it with just a fire round of questions that we do.
Of course.
So, how many hours of sleep do you get?
Wow. I would say like 7 or 8, I think.
Wow. We'll have to ask you when you're back on the pod because I hear you're having a kid soon, so that may dramatically go down.
Yeah.
We'll check back on you in a couple of months. Thing that excites you the most right now? A theme, a sector in crypto Web3?
Yeah. Well, last weekend I finished Balaji Srinivasan's The Network State. So this is like very much to the point of our discussion of common and public goods. And I think, check it out. It's thenetworkstate.com. Mm-hmm. I think what Balaji does well is he like verbalizes, what a lot of us in crypto understand, the broad frontier of innovation of blockchains to be, which is our whole discussion. This is a way of organizing people. This is a way of creating public goods, public governance. And what Balaji is talking about is like, hey, can we use this technology to innovate on like governance itself? In other words, create like digital nations. And I think it's a fascinating discussion. It sounds completely futuristic, but I actually think in the next 10 years we'll almost certainly see it.
Yeah. What's been the hardest thing as an investor in the space? Particularly someone like you who's been early in a lot of things.
Great question. Everything is constantly changing in a nascent space. And that means, and I mean everything. I mean the opportunities. I mean the technologies are obsoleting one another. I mean the structures of how deals are done. The regulatory environment, as we're now starting to feel pretty viscerally in the United States. Just everything. And so as a crypto investor, like your kind of overall goal is to like, how do I make sense of all this stuff and translate it into like a long-term investment? And I think that's super, super challenging.
Would you rather invest in a very talented team in a not so big market or in a massive market with a not so talented team?
The first thing, because I think, when you take small markets and for example, like translate them into a crypto domain, you tend to create new markets. You tend to create more value. Like here's like a dumb example, like which I love to use for NFTs. Think about fonts. Fonts is not a sexy market. You don't see a lot of VCs investing in fonts, and yet fonts are something that are used on like every single web page that you ever like pull up on your phone or on your computer, and every font, generally speaking, is licensed. And today there's this almost like quasi-monopoly where like Google gets a lot of fun licensing out, right? Now imagine what we could do to that market if we, first of all, used a decentralized marketplace where font creators could reach their audiences directly. They could cut out those middlemen. And second of all, use NFTs as a way of tokenizing not just the licenses to fonts, but the revenue streams to fonts, right? I think we would take that market 10x, 20x, 30x if we could popularize something like that. So I think I would always err on like great team who has an amazing vision in a market that's kind of like not obvious to people.
Yeah, but particularly when you layer on these new types of business models and uniquely enabled by kind of Web3 NFTs, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're someone that is pretty smart on the DAO space. What are the biggest challenges that you're seeing with DAOs today?
What a great question. I'm a huge fan of the DAO space, and at the same time, I have this like parental rage, like at it, because it's so. It's like the infrastructure of DAOs is extremely nascent, very naive, doesn't work together well. Like for example, if you're running a DAO, you need like on-chain tools to hold your funds, to settle your transactions. You need off-chain tools for like, I don't know, snapshot or like sentiment analysis. You need communication tools like Discord or Telegram or something else. you need security tools, you need third-party SaaS. Like to actually run a DAO means that you're actually running an organization. And we have a lot of tools in the traditional world to run organizations, and we have a very nascent set of tools in DAOs to run DAOs. Even if those tools worked well, it would still be like extraordinarily hard, for example, to take your whole community and like upgrade them to a new set of tools. And so we're sort of missing we're sort of missing kind of like an operating system that makes all of that work well. So if you're like on Linux and you have apt-get, you can upgrade your tools very quickly. But if you're running a DAO, you don't have anything like that, right? So, this is one of the reasons I'm super interested and have been for a long time an investor in Urbit and what they're doing in terms of, creating an operating system for Web3 technologies.
My last two questions. The first one is, what do you see as the largest NFT market? Art, real estate, tokenized insurance contracts, gaming, like curious. In the next 5-10 years.
So today, like the three main use cases are digital art, which is a minority use case now, collectibles, which I believe is still a majority use case, and in-game assets, which is kind of like growing. Our general thesis is that NFTs are not limited to those verticals. Their NFTs are general financial technology for non-fungible goods, and so they're going to extend to a lot of other like digital content, so movies, music, fonts, icons, things like that. Blog posts are being tokenized. This is the kind of stuff that I get really excited about, because this is one of those spaces where like we haven't tokenized something like this before. They haven't been liquid before. They haven't traded on public markets before, and yet there's like billions of these things. So I wonder if like the tokenization of all blogs in the world might actually be like one of the biggest IPOs of all time, like if not the biggest. But then I also think about real estate, and so today we're very fixated on NFTs as digital representations of digital things, but it's very clear that NFTs can also be extended, and people are extending them to physical things like the title of your house, the deed to your car, whatever it is, right? Sorry, I got those backwards. Deed to your house, title to your car, right? And like when I think about real estate, I mean, holy crap, that's like tens of trillions of dollars. Now, the other component of your question is like, which of these come first? I mean, I definitely think like digital things are much of lower hanging fruit. But for example, like things like music, those areas are going to be like much harder to disrupt than like tokenizing blog posts, which nobody has ever even tried before. Blog posts are like greenfield, and music has a lot of like incumbents. So those differences would matter too.
Yeah. My last question, Jason might have one, but what is something that you wish you knew for a lot of the folks that listen that are either starting their company or starting to invest in their early on in their careers? What is something that you wish you knew, that you know today, that you wish you kind of knew when you were getting started?
Well, I think the company that I started in crypto, which is CoinFund, was formed very organically, right? It was formed out of people who came together with a common interest in crypto. Everyone who helped me build this company, were there because they love crypto, wanted to be there. We didn't have huge pedigree. At some point, we were first-time managers trying to raise money for the first time, and it's really hard, and especially really hard in a new asset class. And today, we're a company of over 30 people, New York, Miami, Boston, other places. We've been able to raise money successfully from institutional investors. We're an RIA, so a regulated entity in the United States with the SEC, right? So we've come sort of a long way as a company. And if I were to do it all again, I wish I could have formed that team like much earlier than we organically did. Like if I had started with the notion of, like let's build an amazing team for this, we could have maybe moved faster.
Totally.
Great. Well, I'll cheat one last because we always like to give either we always like to give either a book or a movie recommendation, especially at summertime. People go to the beach, what have you. They'd like to read or watch a movie. So, Jake, maybe you could give us one last tidbit of wisdom for our listeners, a book or a series, movie that you have recently watched or read that you recommend.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to take a break from crypto every once in a while. I'll tell you how what I do sort of as a hobby. So I live in Miami. There's a lot of Spanish speakers here, and I actually studied Spanish in high school, and I've started to like learn Spanish again now. And I'm actually like pretty good at Spanish. I can understand most things that I read in the newspaper without a dictionary and stuff like that. It's still hard to understand when people speak fast, but in sort of in service of that, one interesting Netflix show, which is Spanish language that I watched recently, is called Somos, and it's kind of a Mexican drama dealing with a town in Mexico and kind of like looking into some of the issues of like the cartel violence that happens there. I thought it was
the
fascinating.
more authentic version of Narcos, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
And then the other thing that I've been watching recently, because I love Nathan Fielder of Nathan For You, is The Rehearsal.
Nice.
And if you watch the first episode of that, it deals with this bar, which is located in Williamsburg, which is, the neighborhood where I come from.
Nice. Well, Jake, stick around because we're going to do a recording this in Spanish. Entonces, si habla español, entonces vamos a hacerlo otra vez para todos nuestros... Just kidding. Thanks for coming on the show, man. This has been a very fascinating discussion. I think it's one of the topics that don't get talked about a lot, but in circles that I'm at, like in investor circles and some of the more kind of deep thinkers in this space, it is something that is kind of not talked about enough, but I think it's super important if you're a founder, if you're an investor, if you're just an observer of these new kind of political economic systems. And so thanks for coming on and sharing your wisdom. I think it's going to be an episode that we constantly look back on to reflect on and also to inform how we think about the evolution of the space, which is still very nascent. And of course, you're someone that has been super early in a lot of these things, NFTs, Web3 generally. And so thinking about DAOs. And so we'll definitely have to have you on maybe after, a couple months after you become a dad and you take a break. We'd love to have you on to continue the conversation, but it's been really fascinating. So thanks for making the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and being like interested in this topic, because I think it's such an important one. And it's one that like most people out there in the public, they don't really like talk about, or there's not a lot of people who like present, public goods as like something that you do in crypto to most mainstream people. So thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jake. This is great.